think this is the first time that Jean-Louis Cohen, he is not, or he's trained as an architect, but I see him more, I know him more as a writer and a historian. And so I think tonight it's less only seeing new projects or contemporary projects, is that also in a way there will be a reflection back, more reflecting, I think, about notions of power. And Jean-Louis Cohen is not the first time with us at the Berlage. For instance, we did once a masterclass with Dominique Perrault in Paris, and then he gave a very enlightening lecture in that masterclass, for instance, on the boulevard system and the whole structure of Paris. And for instance, we also did masterclasses in Venice, I remember. So Jean-Louis Cohen is a very dear friend of the Institute, and he always knows to enlighten us and to bring us on other tracks. And it's also the case that I think Jean-Louis Cohen is one of the people who, originally as an architect, but also trained as an historian, has an incredible memory and an incredible knowledge of history. And I was thinking to whom I could compare him in the Netherlands of historians. And maybe you are familiar with Jan Romein, who wrote a beautiful book about lines and patterns in history. And often when I read texts of you, I see that you make new lines and patterns in the history of the 20th century architecture. And for instance, also he did a study on Casablanca and a kind of Moroccan modern planning and architecture. So it is really a pleasure to have Jean-Louis here, and I'd like to give him the floor, and I look forward to his lecture and the questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Romer. And this mic is working. This is wonderful. Thank you for this very nice introduction. I'm very glad to be here tonight. I realize how unique is the series of lectures giving every year at the Berlage. I took part to one of them on mediation, which ended up as an issue of hunch. So the great thing, you were forgetting this one, but I think this is a great thing to bring to this very original program of advanced study in architecture, also a group of people who are engaging in debating hot issues and sometimes also cold issues, or sometimes frightening issues like the one I will discuss today. So let me show you a first image, which dates exactly back 1 year. These images date from the end of October 2005, and where maybe we can dim the lights a little bit and we'll see the flames on the left. You remember these images perhaps of the burning housing projects in Paris, or at least of cars, parts of buildings which had been set ablaze by the young inhabitants of these housing projects, for the most part children of immigrant workers who had come to France to work in the 60s and 70s. Of course, these images bring to our minds issues of very practical issues about the way these suburbs are run today, issues about poverty, issues about class, issues about race, but also issues about architecture. I think I had a pointer, but you can see without the pointer that these big housing developments were large-scale housing estates built in the 1950s or 60s using a vulgarized version of the modern movement's housing principle. So the relationship to architecture came very clearly to the surface, as many critics said that, in fact, this kind of architecture and the social segregation it meant now in the region of Paris had to do with a feeling of isolation, with a feeling of loneliness and of marginality, which led to the anger of the young settlers. So what I'm saying here is that very often in the current issues, in the events of our daily life in the city, we as architects, and here I will define me as architects, not as a designing architect, but as an architect dealing with culture, dealing with criticism and history, we are very often mobilized and accused of being at the origin of some of the worst social problems. In fact, we clear that architects who designed the project here and built them were inserted in a system of complex relationships precisely with power, precisely with public authorities, and that the authorship of these slabs is, to say the least, shared. I will also insist on one issue beginning this talk. I've been teaching in Paris and in the US, in New York, at New York University, many doctoral students in the past years. And I've been struck by their relative depoliticization, the loss of interest for politics and the loss of the understanding of the meaning of politics in the shaping of architectural objects, reading entire dissertations that were dealing with almost exclusively political problems. For instance, reading stuff on the Team 10 of the architecture of Team 10, which was deeply rooted in the 50s, in the end of European colonial rule in Europe and elsewhere. It is difficult not to talk about politics. Team 10 was also born during the Cold War. Yet many studies about the Team 10, including the rather interesting exhibition presented here at the NAI last year, got rid of this context. So I've been, in a way, genetically related to politics, and here I have to make a couple of personal notes. It's not something I'm doing usually in lectures. Roma knows that, but I think here it was necessary and perhaps interesting for you. So I can define myself as a political being, having grown in Paris in the 50s and having been very active in the events of 1968. On the left, you see the striking École des Beaux-Arts, where I was a student at that time. On the right, you see some of the posters, which were, maybe we could dim this light. I know you're filming, but I don't know if the balance of light is absolutely right to see the contrast of the images. If you think it is so, just let go, but maybe it could be better. Yeah. Okay, so here you see the poster that the students of the École des Beaux-Arts, among whom I was, were doing, posters that were against repression, but also against speculation, profit, etc. So I was born in a generation which was revolted by the fact that the École des Beaux-Arts, at the École des Beaux-Arts, before 68, the students had never been given a studio task dealing with housing. At that time, France was building 300,000 or 350,000 housing units a year, but it wasn't considered as a serious task for students. It was considered as a vulgar task. So we were putting pressure to deal with what was considered as vulgar or not artsy enough, that is housing. And it's one part of the revolt of the students of 68 had to do precisely with the desire of dealing directly with policies, of dealing directly with what the powers of that period were doing. I'm going back by several decades. My background is a very peculiar one. I was born in a French Jewish family, which had been living in Paris for 3 generations, and my the history of my parents was one which dealt heavily with politics. So my interest, when I'm saying I'm a political being and this is maybe genetical, I was born with parents who had a particular history. This on the left is a housing project, if you want. It is the concentration camp of Auschwitz, where my mother spent 2 years during the war after having been arrested for being in the resistance. If she had been deported as a Jew, she would have died, and I would not be here tonight. So I was born between the memory of the war, the memory of Nazis, not only as a policy hostile to the Jews, but as a policy, first of all, hostile, and as a system of power, first of all, hostile to anything democratic. And I was born, on the other hand, you see the sign of the hammer and sickle, the portrait of Maurice Thorez, who was the leader of the French Communist Party, on a cover of Time magazine in 1946. So I was born in a context which was heavily left-wing, which had nothing to do with architecture or anything visual. My parents were absolutely not interested in visual issues, but more in music or literature. Anyway, for me, as for many kids of my generation, growing in Paris during the 1950s was being complete almost all the time referring, even playing in the schoolyard, playing with the memories of World War II, and playing also with the ongoing events. So, for instance, I remember as a very, very small boy fights that were taking place in the streets of Paris during the Cold War. In the early 50s, this is an image of a demonstration against the US war in Korea in 1953. There were very bad fights at that time in the streets of Paris, and architects, by the way, who took part in these demonstrations were banned from professional practice by the architects' organization. Interesting. And on the right, a view of the Vietnam War. Then I grew to politics with the French war in Algeria, the end of the French war in Algeria, which was marked with right-wing terrorism, and of course with the American war in Vietnam. So this is the background in which my generation grew. You could not, and it's not only my personal experience, politics were present in everyday's life. And as soon as you were looking for interesting architectural projects in the late 60s or early 70s, you had to look for particular types of power. And here I want to insist on the plurality of power. All these buildings were built by emerging young architects of the time of the 60s in left-wing local administration, municipalities around Paris. So I want to insist on this layering of power. Architects have always, like movie makers, architects can't produce their works by themselves. They need partners. It's totally banal. They need partners, they need customers, they need backers, they need money, they need decisions, they need public clearance, and this is achieved with a very complex layering of power in Europe. States, regions, cities, cooperatives, building societies. This system is very complex, and very often when one system of power is stuck or is not working or is completely conservative, there are marginal source or alternative sources of powers that allow for more innovation. So when I was a student in the late 60s, early 70s, the interesting buildings that were getting out of the grounds were built by, in the so-called Red Belt around Paris, built by working class municipalities. On the left, you see two projects by the team of the AUA, Atelier d'Urbanisme et d'Architecture, Paul Chemetov and Jean Deroche. On top is in Vigneux in 1965, a sort of populist reinterpretation of the vernacular way of building low-cost houses as done by the local population. It's also, if you look in detail, a building which echoes the work of the Italian neo-realists of the late 1940s, the Tiburtino development outside Rome, by the same team of Chemetov and de Roche in Pantin. This is a sort of brutalist, even more brutalist development of Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, which was typical for this team, and because of its really very marked tectonics, was much more interesting to look at than the high-rise development like the one started with in Clichy. What is interesting in both buildings is the idea that came at that time from Bertolt Brecht, from the German playwright Bertolt Brecht, that the process of making the work had to be shown in the work. And in fact, here what is shown is the manual work of the done on the site, which was left visible. Not only, of course, the formwork, but also the brickwork. There was an intent on showing the process. On the right, you see in Ivry, another municipality south of Paris, the development of also buildings that came from the language of Le Corbusier, and buildings which were much more lyrical. So the real architectural life was happening in the margins of the big power-led projects in these suburbs. And again, some last notes, but this will help you to understand what has been the history I've lived through in the early 70s and until let's say 77. I was very active in the French Communist Party at a time in which this party had more or less 25% of the vote, so it was not a marginal force, and at a time in which we believed somewhat naively that a new manner of doing architecture could develop at the encounter of design, research, and political power. So these are two covers of a journal called La Nouvelle Critique, in which I published. I was 22. I started, so life was beginning very quickly at that time. I published a discussion and organized a discussion on architecture and politics, and later in 74, I was 25, I organized a very big conference entitled Pour un urbanisme, for an urban planning, without any adjective. It was not meant to be democratic. It was not meant to be modern. It was just like Le Corbusier wanted to go towards an architecture and not a modern architecture or a new architecture like in the ridiculous English translation, which will be soon phased out because I'm publishing next year a new English translation, new faithful translation of Le Corbusier's book. So the idea here was that in a class society, to a large extent naively, that in a class society no real urban planning was possible. That the class situation impeded any real structured and human vision of the city. So in order to achieve these new views, what was interesting was the encounter with sociologists, with urban economists, but also with mayors, dealing with local administrators and trying to convince them that their policies would be better developed with interesting, innovative architecture. This was not easy because in the Marxist discourse, the question of architecture in the city has always been perceived as secondary. The main contradiction being the one between capital and labor. Urban issues were also always considered as marginal, and pretending they were important made us increasingly annoying and unpopular to the end, leading to the end to a complete failure of this power group we had shaped, very much modeled on what was the Italian policy of Enrico Berlinguer and the then Italian Communist Party. Then I started to go and see the real stuff. And this is where my scholarly life starts. My scholarly life starts when I started going to the Soviet Union to visit the survivors of the avant-garde. So on the right, you see a photo I shot in 1973 in the studio of Melnikov, of Konstantin Melnikov, who was still alive, with memories from his 25 Paris pavilion. On the left, a page from a book which was an eye-opener and a mind-opener for a generation, written by Anatole Kopp, a Russian-born historian, on the architecture of a Russian avant-garde. So in a way, in front of the, and this is, I think, a very important experience, not only for me, but for many other architects and intellectuals of my generation, in front of the mediocrity of what the so-called political avant-garde had become, we were longing in a nostalgic manner, or in my case, nostalgia became history. Nostalgia is dreaming and mourning. History is producing knowledge. We went back to the history of the Russian avant-garde, and I will remind you that one of the first articles, if not the first article published by Rem Koolhaas, was on Leonidov and a very important contradictory episode in the adjustment between architecture and politics in Russia in the early 1930s. So this interest was not only Kopp was not a scholar, he was a very sloppy scholar. All his footnotes are wrong, his bibliography is ridiculous. He was an architect who had been engaged in politics. He had taken part to these demonstrations of the early 50s. He had later helped the Algerian independence movement and had a lot of trouble because he was one of the underground collaborators of the Algerian freedom fighters. So the notion of a Russian avant-garde aspiring to change daily life was for us a very living one. And this is perhaps the last, or almost the last, autobiographical episode. I then started conveying my experience of talking with Melnikov and others, of going in the streets of Moscow looking for the decrepit buildings of the avant-garde. I transformed it into part of a big exhibition at the Pompidou Center in '79, one called Paris Moscow, which was a very important event in bringing materials of the Russian avant-garde to the West, with major limits, of course, because it was negotiated with the Soviets, and they were extremely opposed to the idea of showing only avant-garde art. So you had, if you look at this slide, you had the Tower of Tatlin and the work of a constructivist in the show, close to more conservative, realist, illusionist painting. On the left is the cover of a book I published during the same year with Marco De Michelis and Manfredo Tafuri on the history of architecture and planning in the Soviet Union, in which there were two important statements which already were aspiring at changing the vision of the history. Instead of considering the Russian avant-garde as such, the idea was to try to understand better the continuities. On one hand, with the pre-1914 developments in Russia, the image my dear Master Kopp had given of a pre-1914 situation was one of total intellectual vacuity, was one of total the reign of architectural eclecticism, and he had forgotten all the reform movements very self-consciously that were flourishing at that time. So we put them back into the picture, and we also put back into the picture and I was one of the first to work on that, the architecture built under Stalinism. At that time, it was absolutely it was total bad taste to mention the architecture of Stalinism, and to try even to look at it and to find it interesting to discuss was totally outside of the accepted canon. So I was one of the first to say this is an interesting experience. This relationship of architecture and power under Stalin is not one-sided, is a complex one, and since that there have been, of course, many works by different scholars and people. Last image is a building on which I worked a lot and which, in a way, was for me a trigger in trying to understand the relationship between power and architecture at the local level. The building on the left had perhaps the longest ribbon windows ever built. You remember, of course, Le Corbusier's 5 points of the new architecture, the free plan, the free facade, the ribbon fence window, the pilotis. Here you see how many pilotis there are under this school, and the flat roof. A flat roof is one of the longest ever built. The school, however, was not built by Le Corbusier, but by his arch rival André Lursat, a French modernist, in the south of Paris in 1933. What was interesting here? Well, and this is where I started this series of revisions, if you want, was that already in the early 70s, postmodernism was rising. The idea that modernism was intrinsically anti-popular was based on the idea of forcing the happiness of people was becoming increasingly popular. And I took this example as a counter-example. You see on the right a cartoon. It's not well focused, but we see a cartoon here where two bourgeois are mocking the local left-wing rulers because and they say they pretend to build the future world and they don't even understand that schools need a roof. So mocking the flat roof. This building was incredibly popular and became very quickly at the time of its construction a symbol of modernization for inhabitants of very impoverished and very miserable suburbs. They saw the white school built by modern architecture as the hope of a standard of social infrastructure and a standard of urbanity which was only reached in the bourgeois areas of the city. And this story could be told in many other parts of Europe at that time. So for me, understanding better this relationship became important. And here I shift perhaps to a broader discussion of the relationship between architecture, politics, and the question of memory and history. Here we find two examples of what I would call the happy encounter which has made interesting modern architecture in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. The encounter between a community, a reform-oriented community, and a reform-oriented architect, or rather, if you want, the encounter between innovative form and social reform. On the left is a banner. This banner is a well-known one. It was presented as a gift to the architect Bruno Taut by the inhabitants of the garden city of Falkenberg, built by Taut in the south of Berlin, still standing in very good shape today. What did it mean? Every inhabitant had given a small piece of fabric, and they had been put together in order to create a banner with this little house and a sort of expressionist landscape, in order to thank the architect for having created a successful and happy community. So a sign of gratitude, pretty much in the manner the local inhabitants were thankful to the mayor and the architect for this new school, which completely overshadowed the shacks in which people were living. So this is the encounter between the social reform movement and architecture. On the right is a rather similar attempt, mid-1930s in south of Paris, the garden city of Châtenay-Malabry. And the tower here, I want to insist on the tower. This tower, which sits on top of the housing estate, is not a church tower. It's not a belfry like in a Flemish town or Dutch town hall. But it's not, of course, a tower of offices. The tower is housing on the model of the one built by Salle in Amsterdam South, for instance. So the idea here is that the community, a new type of community will emerge from these modern peripheries, one in which various social groups, from the intellectuals to the workers living in the nearby slabs, will be able to live together. So I think here we find the happy encounter, which takes place often in a very different context. But I just want to underline this episode. At the same time, and we could write the history in a different manner, there were also radical municipalities that built conservative housing. We know that. So there were in Germany social democratic municipalities which built houses with pitched roofs, garden cities without any communal spirit. And we also know now, I will return to this later, that conservative and sometimes totalitarian structures of power were able to accept, endorse, and sometimes encourage more radical architecture. So, but what I want to say here is that for a long period of time, history was underlining and discussing only these examples. Most textbooks, including, I'm talking about that because I'm now struggling with the writing of a new textbook to be published by Faden, if I'm able to complete it next year. And I'm trying to get away precisely from this canon to say, okay, the history of modern architecture is a history of happy encounters. It is also a history of disastrous encounters, or the history of no encounters, missed encounters. Okay, so now let's move to the question of memory, which was in the title of my talk. Power is dealing with architecture. As we know, power is based on, first of all, on the military control of territories, and the military control of territories is based on the construction of fortresses, of prisons. This one was the fortress, medieval prison turned into a fortress of the Bastille in Paris. Power is about building an infrastructure for its survival, for its reproduction. Power is also based on, well, power is never an end in itself. Power is very often a device a ruling class is using to survive, and in order to function, builds other structures and other constructions. So power is affirmed, is developed, is in a way preserved and renewed through construction. And therefore, buildings are identified with power in various manners. They can be represented as the example of splendor and as the seat of legitimate power. They can also be perceived as the seat of illegitimacy. And such was, of course, the case of the Bastille. In this painting by the renowned landscape painter Hubert Robert, we see the crowd of Paris demolishing the Bastille, and the stonework and the woodwork being thrown down and then carried away. So it's an example of the demolition of an extreme symbol of power. Other structures, and I'm dealing with the history of Paris for a little while. Other buildings were so associated with power that when they were partly demolished, they would never be rebuilt. So one such example, if you know Paris, is the missing part of the monumental scheme built around the Louvre. This is the Renaissance Louvre. This is the classical Louvre before I. Empai's pyramid, photograph from the 1950s. And here the missing piece is the palace of the Tuileries, which was a magnificent Renaissance palace, but it was the seat of the hated court of Napoleon III, and when it got partially burned during the Paris Commune of 1871, the Republican rulers of the country refused to restore it, and it was torn down because symbolically it represented the old regime. At some point, it could have become the first museum of modern art ever, because it was meant to house collections of the then modern painters. But in the end, it was torn down because the emerging Republican regime didn't want to see any major structure associated with the hated Napoleonic power. Another example, this one is a positive one, is what I would call the policy of expiation, the policy of symbolic rejection of a history that had just happened. We are again in Paris. We're on the top of the hill of Montmartre. The Church of the Sacred Heart was built in the 1870s with a nationwide collection of money, essentially to invoke the protection and the mercy of God after the Paris Commune. So the Paris Commune had been marked by a series of anti-religious violence in order to beg, in order to draw the attention, the benevolent attention of God towards France. This church was built in a place with Montmartre, which was known as being one of the most revolutionary and one of the most radical parts of the city. So you see, on one hand, one doesn't reconstruct a symbol of a regime, and this is what the Republicans are deciding. But in parallel and in conflict with the Republicans, the clericals, the religious right, builds this rather horrendous building, by the way. So it's interesting to see that very often the cities are places of competition between buildings. I'll give you another example without a slide. You're familiar with the Victoriano in Rome, the big Altare della Patria, the monument to Vittorio Emanuele, which is built on top of the Capitol Hill. The building is, of course, synonymous for everybody of ridiculous architectural historicism, but the perception it had in Rome at the end of the 19th century was totally different. The building was perceived rightly as the affirmation of Italy against the Pope, of Italy as a nation, of the Italian people represented by their king against the Pope, against St. Peter's. So very often a building can't be just seen in itself like the Sacré-Cœur. It has to be related. It was made to be visible from every part of the city. It has to be visible in a dialogue with buildings that are carrying other political meanings. So let's now move east. And I want to show you the mysterious image which was on the lecture's poster. This image is a sort of imitation of an old roll of parchment, which has been inserted on top of the house of the architect in Moscow in 1940. The guy who did that had a very particular history. His name was Andrei Burov. Burov was a young constructivist who had designed the stage set for one of the main films of Sergei Eisenstein called The General Line. So he was a former member of the avant-garde who had adapted to the new language and built this neoclassical building. But what he shows here is very interesting, is perhaps a sort of joke. The new plan of Moscow of 1945, which is a plan embodying the ideals of the Stalinist regime, is shown as if it were a very old document inscribed in the history of Moscow, as if it were an old Roman plan, such as the ones you find on the etchings of Piranesi in the 18th century. And what, of course, the message here by Burov, it's a sort of flattering message which goes into the direction of the power. The plan of Moscow is presented as being in the continuity of what And this is here that memory and history are encountering the question of power. If you remember the history of Russia, Peter the Great has moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg in 1703 and has created the city of Petersburg in 1703, and then the capital had been moved there slightly later. The Soviets moved back the capital to Moscow, but they tried to reshape Moscow on the image of Petersburg, using a series of urban compositions that had been used already before in Petersburg. And so this claim for legitimacy, which was bringing back not only power, but also the design of power to Moscow, is here reproduced in this rather nice object, this rather nice artifact made by one retired member of the avant-garde. Here, let's see then how the destiny, and here we see how memory and history again work together, in order to build the building which was supposed to crown the new Moscow. A series of competitions were held in the early 1930s, one in Vien by a young architect trained in Italy, Boris Yofan. The Palace of Soviets of Yofan was meant on this rather hilarious comparison image published in Moscow in the late 30s. It was, of course, meant to overshadow the Eiffel Tower, and of course, it was meant to overshadow American skyscrapers. You see that the idea was to use, in short, to use the legs of the Eiffel Tower, to put a big auditorium between them, and on top of them to build a skyscraper, and on top of a skyscraper, a gigantic statue of Lenin. So this is the Statue of Liberty, this is Rockefeller Center, and this is the Eiffel Tower, all combined in one building. In order to build this rather extravagant object, a big church was blown up. There are extraordinary movie shots of the demolition of the use of dynamite to blow the church, which had been built in 1830 and was already an object of memory. The church had been built to celebrate the victory of the Russians over Napoleon in 1812. So the church is blown out, and then construction begins. Anyway, the structure was so heavy, the ground so difficult to use that it, in a way, and it was so costly that the project was eventually dropped in 1946. And as we know, one of the Colas's most extraordinary theoretical projects is based on the idea that the swimming pool which got built here, got dug in the foundations, was to move and cross the Atlantic anyway. The swimming pool was all that was left in the existing foundations of the building. When Yeltsin took power in 1993, the first gesture the new Russian government made was to rebuild the church here. So they did a rather horrendous, this is the new church here, and a Stalinist skyscraper in the back. This is a rather, I think, striking view of the Church of Christ Savior, which is rebuilt with a titanium dome and a rather monstrous collection of details. It's remarkable to see here also, in a way, an example of expiation, together with a return of religion to Russia. What the church accomplishes here is exactly the function that the Sacré-Cœur had accomplished in Paris, to ask for divine forgiveness. At the same time, what is interesting is that, in fact, the style that the new Russian bourgeoisie perceived as the best to express its values is certainly not this, and even less modernism, but what we see in the back. The Stalinist skyscrapers are now becoming the ultimate fashion in Moscow, and a new skyscraper using this language of this historicist language and referring explicitly to the so-called Seven Sisters, to the seven Stalinist skyscrapers built between in the end of the 40s, in the beginning of the 50s. There are new such buildings coming out. So the issue of power is also at work in the way the heritage is conceived. And here I want to show you 3 images. 3 buildings built in the 1920s, and perhaps the best buildings, among the best buildings of the Russian avant-garde. What is their destiny today? And here we're meeting not only the issue of power, but also the issue of time and how buildings change and what is the building's life in time. On top is a workers' club by Melnikov, built for the workers of the Moscow streetcars in the 20s, the Rusakov Club. Beautiful building with a very expressionist thrust forward. With the money earned with building this club and 4 others, Melnikov was able to build his own house. Unique. No other Russian architect built a house for himself between 1914 and 1994. For 80 years, never happened. Melnikov did it, and the house is still almost standing in bad shape. And here we see the current condition of the communal house of Ginsburg, built for the Ministry of Finance. See how the ribbon windows are now totally closed, and the situation of this building, which was built by a ministry for its employees. So here, a labor union. Here, a new ministry. Here, a very creative individual. All these buildings now belong to the same person. Today, in 2006, a senator and developer called Mr. Gordyev, who is a friend of Putin and who owns all the 3 buildings and has threatened to demolish them, to build supermarkets, parking lots, casinos. Moscow is increasingly looking like Las Vegas. We see today, interestingly, that the new Russian power is paying a lip service to the architecture of the avant-garde. The mayor of Moscow, Lushkov, endorsed the preservation of some of these objects during a very highly publicized conference in spring of this year, held with UNESCO and Docomomo and Momo anything. But basically, what is left of the utopia are buildings which have lost their content. The utopia of the communal house is lost. The utopia of the workers' club as a place of cultural transformation is lost, and Melnikov is dead. And his son also. So I think it's interesting to see here that how finally the meaning that these buildings had, which was not only about it was about clearly a question of form, but it was also a question of program, of the encounter of a completely new type of program with a new type of form. All the major buildings of the 20th century have been buildings which have transformed their program, which have stolen a little bit of power, if you want, which have not accepted what power was requiring for them. And so now the striking aspect in terms of memory is that the meaning of this building is getting lost to everybody but a handful of architectural historians and fetishists, and that in fact these buildings will risk becoming only small signs. Maybe Senator Gordyev will build a gigantic underground shopping mall here, and we'll just keep this as a sort of entrance kiosk on top of it. This is what has happened with other buildings. I took part to an encounter with the mayor of Moscow, Lushkov, one of the most powerful administrator of any city in the world, perhaps the most powerful, because he rules absolutely like a Tsar, a city of 10 million inhabitants. His wife is the city's most active real estate developer. Another another important scene is Berlin, where also issues of memory have been very much at work since the reunification of Germany and of Berlin itself. So here are 2 examples of additions. On the left, a restored addition. This was this building, this 19th century office building was completely transformed by Erich Mendelssohn in 1923. It was the building of a Jewish-owned newspaper, the Berliner Tageblatt, and Mendelssohn added this extraordinary dynamic structure on top of a static 19th century structure. This part was almost completely gone. The building was in East Berlin, close to the wall, and was rebuilt. And everybody is happy. Everybody is happy. It's a newly rediscovered relic. On the right, we see another restoration which goes through, which uses the imposition, the superimposition of a new structure. This is the old Reichstag, which was built in the 1880s on a classical model by the architect Vallot, which had been ruined during the war, but partially rebuilt to house sessions of the West German Parliament. The building has been transformed by Norman Foster with a rather, I think, problematic cupola. Many other projects had been done in the competition before, but what we see here is, in fact, this rather interesting, even if I have reservations about the building on the right, articulation of the new and the old. Here, a double one. A renovation of the 20s, again rediscovered and restored. Here, of course, a new life in a building which had a complex political history. The issue of reconstruction is at work, of course, in Berlin. And we meet again, surprisingly, 120 years after the debate on the Tuileries in Paris, the question of reconstruction. In this case, the buildings whose reconstruction is discussed is the Berliner Schloss, the castle of the Hohenzollern, which stood for decades as a symbol of the German militarist power, the power of the emperor, the power of the German state after unification, and which was blown out by the East Germans in 1949. Like the Tuileries, the castle was in much better state than many buildings which have been very well restored. It was destroyed for political reasons. So is it going to happen again? There is a question mark. I mentioned I forgot to tell that today some arch-conservative Paris art historians and fetishists are pleading for reconstruction of the Tuileries. So what will happen with the Bauakademie of Schinkel is another issue. Carl Friedrich Schinkel had built in the 1820s the building of the architectural school after having visited structures, industrial structures in England. And this building was a building made out of brick, much more rational in its construction and easier to reconstruct than the castle. It was destroyed by the East Germans in the 60s in order to build a very ugly slab for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And on the right, what you see is the mock-up of the building today with, I think this is a big Mercedes-Benz ad. And here you see the corner made up in brick and a fabric, a canvas reconstruction of the building. So is it legitimate? What would be the meaning today of this building? Would it mean, and here, of course, I have no solution to the debate, but would it mean restoring the continuity of history and getting beyond the association of a building with dark moments in German and European history? What would be the meaning here of the Bauakademie? Rebuilding the Bauakademie would, alluding, if you take it literally, to a period in which the Prussian state was one of the most advanced, enlightened states in Europe, and in which this building was developed by Schinkel, who had an apartment in it, not only as a school for architects, but also as a school for craftspeople. So, but this meaning would probably get lost in front of the meaning of the sort of Disneyification of central Berlin. It would simply become a building in a crowd of other historical piece is rebuilt. And finally, of course, you know that there is a very big debate on the question of the Palace of the Republic. The debate is now closed. This building, which was not an architectural masterpiece, had been built by the East Germans and was very important in the self-representation of of the Eastern German society. The building was where major political events, but also major concerts were held. And this building was, which was in perfect shape, had only one problem: asbestos. But the problem of asbestos and the so-called environmental concerns have been used and in a way manipulated to say that the building was unhealthy. In fact, it was politically unhealthy, and despite the support it had for a major part of the Berlin population, will be torn down. Let me return to another issue, which is pretty much the same, by the way. Reconstructing Schinkel, reconstructing the Berliner Schloss is a tricky question in terms of documentation. But the building had existed. The buildings had existed. They were extensively photographed. You had measure drawings, etc. The issue of building an object which had never existed is a more tricky one, and another time intersects problems of power here. And in this particular case, the problem of local power. What you see on the left is one of the last projects, I wouldn't say of Le Corbusier, but of Le Corbusier's studio, the church of Saint-Pierre in Firminy, near Saint-Étienne, the southeast of France. Corb died in 1965 when the church had not been built, not been started. The project had been developed by one of his assistants called José Oubrerie. And everyone mourned. Le Corbusier was not very religious. He was of Protestant background and had built a church, a Catholic church and a monastery, always fearing the reaction of the Catholics. This is documented in the letters to and from his mother. And he understood this church as a sort of industrial building, working on the model of cooling towers, such as the ones in Ahmedabad he had used when he built the Parliament building in Chandigarh. So after 40 years, finally, the money has been found to build this building, no longer as a church. And this is also an example of how systems of the various types of power can change and die sometimes. The church is no longer in the condition of building anything in France. So the building was transformed into a sort of cultural center which could work as a church. Culture being the new religion, there is a logical continuity. And the question which is set when you look at the quality of the concrete here and inside the building is, of course, its perfection. Le Corbusier was an architect who liked to deal with the traces of labor and with imperfection. Building a structure he had at least partially designed without him is in a way betraying the intentions, because he never left a building without any intervention. I'll give you just one example. When he built structures like the Carpenter Center in Boston, which is not perhaps the best Corbusier, but he never visited the site, but constantly corresponded with José Luis Sert on the detailing, on the solutions. He had a real input through telephone, through telegrams, through letters, etc. Here, of course, no input from Corb, and so it's a sort of blown-up model that we see. The initial structure of power was too weak to carry it, the church, taken up by the metropolitan administration of Saint-Étienne. The church becomes a sort of large built model, and certainly not the poetic structure that Le Corbusier had, once again, at least partially imagined. So let me return to another question of memory and history, one in which I was involved, and to a few other remarks. Realize I'm being a little long, perhaps. Here we see one of the most extraordinary examples of the encounters between modern architecture and history. The scheme that we see on the left and on the right, here it's photographed by the architect who was also an amateur pilot, is the housing scheme at Drancy, north of Paris, completed in 1935. The first high-rise steel frame towers in used for housing in France, 14 floors. And you see the model here, the towers, the slabs, and these U-shaped buildings. The architects were Baudouin and Lotz. And a major contribution was given by Jean Prouvé, who designed the metallic facades and many details. The building, it's interesting, was not accepted locally. Look at the fabric. It's a suburban fabric of little houses. The building, in a way, was perceived, the scheme was perceived as a totally colonial, imposed scheme. So it remained empty for several years, was then inhabited by gendarmes, by French policemen. So when the war broke out in 1940, you had police people here. The U building was not totally completed, and it was very easy to transform this building into a prisoners' camp. So at first, German prisoners you needed only one point of control here. So at first, it became a camp of prisoners. And then, when the Germans, of German prisoners, after the German victory in July 1940, the Vichy administration took up the camp and started working with Germans. So you had this very extraordinary situation. 1942. What you see on the left is a page of an extremely well-known book, a book published by José Luis Sert in the US, Can Our Cities Survive? A propaganda book for functionalist urbanists, with the first publication of the Charter from Athens, or at least from its main mottos, from its main slogans. And you see the Lamuette, the Drancy scheme on the left, shown as an exemplary type of modern housing. On the right, you see the same scheme, which is used as a concentration camp, where perhaps 60,000 Jews were kept in prison before being sent to the gas chambers. So what had started as a sort of modernist, generous heterotopia, we see it, that is a space which was a sort of other space different from everything around it, became a sort of murderous, criminal heterotopia in the early 40s. After the war, the situation changed. Of course, civil life returned to this place. A small memorial plate was put somewhere. And in the 70s, the lack of maintenance, and I would say the quite self-conscious lack of maintenance, led to the demolition of the towers, the U being the only part preserved. So now, the question which was asked last year in a small competition was, what kind of memorial can we do today in this place? And I took part to this competition together with Roger Diener, who's a well-known architect in Basel. Roger worked on a small, constructing a small museum here located just in front of the surviving U. You see a view here of the building design, and he asked me to work on the exhibition inside and on the historical interpretation. Very exciting task. And a very big conflict, because when I discussed the fact that the architecture of the place was not an innocent coincidence, that in fact the panoptical character here of the place, the fact that the initial destiny of the scheme had been so disastrous, this in a way had a load, was not the real reason of the transformation of the camp into, of the scheme into a camp, but had also a meaning. And that the history of why this particular camp here in this peaceful suburb of Paris could not be solved simply by looking at the history of Nazism and at the history of the Holocaust. that you needed to address also architectural ethics. And this was absolutely refused by the jury of the competition. So in the end, they told Roger, your project is wonderful, we hire you, but don't work with this guy. And I don't know what they'll do, but they will probably get rid of the architectural meaning as it were an additional embarrassment to the fact of acknowledging the role of the French in the deportation of the Jews. French being at the same time, as a people, much more generous than other people in Europe. I just remind you that proportionally 3 or 4 times as many Jews were deported from the Netherlands than from France, in taking into account the difference of population. Good. So now a series of final remarks on the relationship of what I'm doing. I am not a designer. I am an architect, an architectural historian, sorry, and I'm working, and my tool is knowledge. So I just want to underline a few points before concluding. The first one is, of course, banal, but is extremely important. No single major piece of architecture in the 20th century can be taken out from its political context and its relationship with power. Here we see 2 rather similar programs. Workers' Club built in Moscow by Golosov on the left, the Casa del Fascio in Como by Terrani on the right, with a photomontage celebrating the achievements of the regime. This was, of course, the administration of a fascist regime, but also a place for cultural activities. We see 2 examples in which 2 regimes used self-consciously, at a particular moment of their development, architecture as a medium. And they used modernist architecture as a medium before turning to other media. Another point is that architecture is also a sort of mediating entity, a realm of mediation between power and previous history. Power tries to gain legitimacy and to express it using buildings. Here I take one example of the center of colonial Algiers, a magnificent city which is totally intact today. And we see 2 buildings which were used, which were built in the early 20th century. The post office on the right, the headquarters of the main newspaper, La Dépêche Algérienne, both built in between 1900 and 1910. In contrast to the previous buildings, even including the public ones which looked like Paris or Marseille in a warmer climate, the political rulers in the early 20th century wanted to express the Algerianity of their presence, wanted to underline the fact that they were the best interpreters of Islamic tradition, taking examples not from Algiers itself, but from the city of Tlemcen in Algeria, which is the city where the influence of Andalusian architecture, of the best architecture of the 13th and 14th century, can be found. Another point. Architects and historians use politics. We know the history of Le Corbusier very well, at least it is known. What we see on the right is the Hôtel du Parc in Vichy, in central France, where the government of Pétain, we see the Marshal Pétain who ruled France under the German pressure, under German control from 40 to 43. Here is a young city planner called Gaston Bardet, who would be a major character and who worked for the plan of Vichy under Pétain. Le Corbusier spent 18 months in Vichy trying to work his ways with the government. The usual treatment in Vichy, the usual cure, lasts for 3 weeks, maybe 6. So he was not there for reasons of health. He was there because he wanted to use his connections in the Vichy state machine to continue his project. Yet, as I was saying to students before, Le Corbusier was clearly trying to manipulate in favor of ideas for which he was not making and designs for which he was not making any compromise. Le Corbusier sold exactly or basically the same ideas to Stalin, to Mussolini, to Pétain, without changing anything. So politics and power is also, I mean, the use of architecture by power is not one-sided. Architects are also using power. Without power and without the authority, which was sort of a totalizing construct of Le Corbusier, his plans would never have been possible. And in fact, he only met one such authority in Chandigarh, Nehru, who had already commissioned the plan to someone else and who found Le Corbusier as a backup for Albert Meyer in 1950. We have also to be careful when we try to identify modernism and the avant-garde with the left and social democracy and the totalitarian regimes and conservative architecture. Here we see the cover and a page of the absolute bestseller of architectural publishing since the invention of printing. It's not Palladio's 4 books on architecture. It's not SMXL XL. The absolute bestseller is the book by Ernst Neufert, published in 1936 in German, a course of architectural design, a handbook which was translated in 40 languages, including Chinese and Japanese, and perhaps Esperanto, I don't know, which has earned millions to his author. But who was Neufert? Here we see an extravagant page about the measurements of man, and we see man alone and man in group, man marching at a military, with a military step. Neufert was, as a young architect, had been trained at the Bauhaus and had worked as the office head of Walter Gropius to build the Bauhaus in Dessau. He became, after having published his book, the main collaborator of Albert Speer on the reorganization of the war industries of Germany and later on the preparation of reconstruction. So in fact, besides the language of official neoclassicism, Nazism was about the modernization of Germany and the use of architects who were affiliated with the moderns to achieve this. These regimes, and here I'm returning to Moscow, were also capable of accepting the continuity of individual architects' obsessions. And here we have the example of the architect Zholtovsky. Zholtovsky was Neo-Palladian in 1912 in Moscow. 1934, one of the first buildings of socialist realism, he returned to Palladio, or he continued working with Palladio. He only changed his model. This is Palazzo Thiene in Vicenza, and this is the Loggia del Capitaniato, also in Vicenza. He just changed models, but he went on with the same ideas. Architecture is at work also in context of violent conflict between countries. Here is a topic I've studied. Occupation architecture of the Germans in France during the war, 40 to 44. Here is a poster of the Germans in Strasbourg. This is the silhouette of a Strasbourg cathedral, and the slogan is, "Let's get rid of the French beret." Plunder is the beret, is the black hat typical of French folklore. And here on the right, we see a poster of the French in Germany after 45, when they will reintroduce some aspects of modernism, and the poster shows you this dove carrying a French colored ribbon over the ruins of Nazism. So architecture is also a companion to policies of occupation. Architecture is also as I said it before, used by powers, and architects are used to powers in order to give ideals or in order to reject canons and ideals. On top is the Court of Justice in Casablanca in Morocco, built in the 20s as a neo-Islamic building with very abstract elements. The meaning of this was to reject the former European models and to pretend that the new regime established in Morocco by the French was protecting traditional values. At the bottom is a very interesting plan. I hear you're working in Brasilia, but Niemeyer has done other plans which are sometimes also very interesting. This is the city plan designed for Niemeyer by Algiers, for Niemeyer in Algiers for the Algerian government in the 60s. The Algerian government after the independence of 62 wanted to hire architects who were not affiliated with the former colonial power, France, and even less with America. So they looked for people like Enzo Tange, who worked for them, and like Niemeyer, who designed the city center from Algiers, which is doubly new, doubly as it looks towards a new realm of references, and also new because it turns its back to the existing colonial city of Algiers, the one I've shown before. So architecture can be also at the service of these changes. Finally, the history of architecture can be sometimes, and this is how I understand sometimes architectural history, can be at the service of the losers of real history. Architectural history, cities are built on top of many corpses and of many unbuilt projects, some of which are sometimes incorporated into the real city, and others sometimes are totally lost and in particular forgotten by the inhabitants of the city. So here two examples. On the left, I'm returning to Leonidov and his project for the Ministry of Heavy Industry of 1934. As you see here, one of the tropes of modern designers was the relationship between the skyscraper and the airplane, a sort of prophetic feeling of a potentially dangerous encounter. But what is interesting, of course, here is the lyrical and programmatic boldness of a project of Leonidov, which might be today reintroduced in a somehow ridiculous or irrelevant manner by some contemporary Russian designers. On the right, what we see is, I think, pretty much as Leonidov and pretty contemporary, is one of the most revolutionary projects of the 1930s, the Maison de la Publicité, the house of the advertising industries, designed by Oskar Nitschke, who was a student of Perret and later worked for Harrison and Abramowitz in the US, designed on the Champs-Élysées. This is one of the first examples of a building which is becoming a support for communication. The building itself, the tectonics of the buildings are still present here, are not clearly visible. What is important is this sort of interface between building and city, carrying messages. We could see Nitschke taught at Yale when Richard Rogers was at Yale University in the 50s, and it might be, or maybe early 60s, and there is a certain continuity between this project and what Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano did for their first design for the Pompidou Center, which was understood as a talking facade, as a communicative facade towards the city. So these two architects are losers. Nitschke never went to the US, never had his proper office, worked as a teacher, worked in the office of Harrison, designing the first aluminum curtain wall for the Alcoa building in Pittsburgh. The role of the historian, I don't like the term architectural historian, the role of the architect dealing with history or the historians dealing with architecture is also sometimes to get a revenge over the state power or money powers which made some projects impossible. And I will return here with my last slides to the Paris situation. The role of the history of architecture today is also to try to give a better perspective to the reasons of the current situation of our European suburbs. It's clear that the large-scale estates, this one is the one of Sarcelles, a legendary one in the north of Paris. You might even see it from the arriving tracks of Vitalis coming from Holland. An object like Sarcelles is not only defined by decisions in the making of its plan, which are based on the encounter between functionalism in the repetition of standardized element and Bazar in the overall planning. This is only one explanation. You have to go back to a series of other decisions in the strategic movement of populations and social classes around the country to understand it. You cannot understand the impoverishment and the crisis of the suburbs if you don't take into account at least two aspects. First of one, the planning policies developed in France in the 1960s. This is the plan of the Paris region. Central Paris, in black, the new town. In the 1960s, central government put public money not in the modernization of the suburbs or in the construction of decent housing developments, but in the creation of new towns meant for the middle class. So this led directly to the crisis of suburbs, which has one major drawback: they were not voting right. That is, they were not voting for the right. So they were left alone to rot, and the money was put into the new towns. Later, beginning in the 80s, and here the left-wing governments under Mitterrand are responsible, the balance of these high-rise schemes was further destroyed by the massive state support to the dream of a single-family home. This led to the departure of the middle class or part of the working class, the best paid working class families from these housing estates where the impoverished migrant workers were left alone. So what we see today, the way we interpret the situation is far from being alone related to architecture. It is related to this time an unsuccessful encounter between the architecture of repetition, the architecture of massification, and state policies. So today what is left to the architect, and it's not my job here to sketch a program, but I think that what the architects have to do in front of such situations is refusing to be scapegoats, refusing to be blamed for decisions they unquestionably participated in and sometimes aggravated, but never created by themselves. And also there is no need to be for any solidarity with a generation that sometimes cynically build these schemes. What is important today is to discuss such concept as what is a just city, what would be the strategies to get back, to empower these people to have a grip on the situation in which they are, what are the solutions in terms of density, what are the choices to be offered to them, what are the means according to which social mixity can be achieved in these socially monotonous schemes. These are all very, I think, responsible goals that democratically conscious profession can establish for itself. And of course, this incorporates pursuing a creative and critical dialogue with what history tells us. That is, stories that are not there to be celebrated, that are not there to be framed on the wall, but to be discussed and critically rethought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who has already heard the question? Well, then I I begin? I think you showed us a very rich palette of the complexity, how power can be executed and always is present and has different extremes and qualities. And there was one remark which intrigued also my own research, that you said in Le Corbusier's work in relation to power and expression, there is always, if I heard it right, the need to that it's imperfect. So how do you read this imperfection in relation to the presence of all kinds of powers in the work? Or was this a misunderstanding of?
No, I don't remember. I've said it exactly, but I think the question here, I would put it in a different perspective. Dealing with building architecture is dealing with time, is defined time. So it's being able, and this is where, of course, this job is interesting. It is answering the explicit needs of one particular source of power and money, which is in front of you, but in fact addressing a longer span of life, planning for a longer span of time. So the architects of the Louvre were building palaces, but these palaces turned out to be also very beautiful museums at that time. The architects of some apparently boring barracks or hospitals of the 19th century design buildings which have survived well for other purposes. So I think this the question is the question of the mutual instrumentalization of power and architecture is important one. Using answering, and in this respect, the architect is sometimes the only. This is where also democracy finds its limits. Both absolute power and democracy find their limits when dealing with time. Projects made in participation are projects which in a way cater for the expressed need of one generation, the generation of people who are there in the meeting room with the architects. But the architect has to interiorize what will happen later, has to make possible the changes for the next generation. At least it's my understanding. Of course, you can subscribe to the idea that buildings are ephemeral constructs and that after all, they become obsolete, they have to vanish, and you have to go to make them over. But our human experience, even with the worst buildings, is that they last longer than a generation. They're often now, with price of real estate, they can no longer be afforded in the sphere of housing by one generation only. This is something that started in Japan, where the savings of one generation were not enough to pay for an apartment in Tokyo, that you needed the savings of two generations. So this question of duration and leaving room, not for change, but leaving room for reinterpretation is, I think, a major one, and it's a question in which the architect gains back his or her revenge in time over the power that has ordered, commissioned, and funded a structure.
Now, in fact, what I try to hint at is another aspect that I think you're very right, and you put it in very nice words, the revenge over time. But what I, for instance, read in work of La Tourette, there is a certain unfinishedness in the material, a certain imperfection even in the aesthetics, which always, so maybe also in the organization survives by its scales and the sizes, so it could become something else, but there is also in the representation of the form or how the power is present, it is never monological, it's never perfect. So it's not policing, but it allows interpretation.
Yeah. It has, this of course has to be seen in various ways, because there has always been the idea, and architects reading Ruskin and reading in Ruskin about the creativity of the medieval builders, stone crafters, stone masons, etc. Were eager sometimes to leave space for interpretation, especially in the ornamentation. So this was one attitude. But don't forget that the brutalism of Le Corbusier was almost coincidental. The brutalism by Le Corbusier is the encounter of two phenomena. One is the miserable funding of his reconstruction project, especially in Marseille. So he had to build Marseille with very bad quality concrete, with lousy contractors because the project cost too much and the money was vanishing. And in the end, he turned this into something different. Instead of saying, my work has been wasted by this lousy concrete work, he said, this lousy concrete work is wonderful, is very noble, because one sees the hand of man, because one sees creativity at work, because my work becomes better at a time in which, of course, Dubuffet and Art Brut were emerging, at a time in which the question of facture was emerging as an important one in art, at a time in which texture was coming to the forefront in sculpture. So in a way, what was really creative and extraordinary was the way of instead of pretending to be a victim and to have been betrayed by lousy concrete, to say this gives an entirely new dimension to my architecture.
Well, first of all, thank you for your talk. And there is actually one thing that was coming to my mind while you were showing this amazing sequence of artifacts, which is actually exactly the question of time. And how much this is very often fetishized by architects as literally an architecture that changed. Well, I think here we see really the buildings almost as a theater in which events takes place. And of course, one issue that really was very strongly coming out from your talk is to really address, especially within your point of view as an historian, within the kind of production of memories of today, is a question of monumentality. And I was really thinking to, I don't know, maybe this is a very old-fashioned reference, but to this distinction that Rossi did in his book, The Architecture of the City, between what he would call the pathological artifact and propelling artifact. I mean, let's say the pathological monumentality or artifact is this that is so much linked to its own meaning, to its own value, that becomes like a black hole within the city. While propelling artifacts are those who actually are able to play with time and without losing actually their own meaning, their own significance. They're not just like neutral containers, but without losing, they're able to somehow to unfold with history as an active agent, not as a kind of something to musealize. And I'm wondering whether in many of today contested artifacts, like the Reichstag, or if this is not really an example of how today monumentality can only be represented as a very pathological entity, as something that cannot be seen as an open, let's say, moments of reinterpretation of history, but is only like a replica, or almost like a sort of moments of also discomforts with history in a way.
Well, this is a very complex issue, but of course monumentality has never been totally excised by the moderns. They wrote a lot against the monument, but there were a series of repressed themes. One was the monument, the other was the ornament, but they nonetheless dealt with monument and ornament in many ways. The Reichstag is a particular type of monument. It is a sort of, if you get back, I mean, Rossi's writing on the monument is very interesting because it's constantly referred to the non-monumental, that is the larger artifact of the city. But for me, the most important writing of the 20th century on the issue is the fundamental text of Alois Riegel, the modern cult of monument, which has been translated into English in the last issues of Oppositions magazine, where Riegel extends the notion of monuments to what he calls the historical, the commemorative monument, the rememorative monument, the intentional monument, and the unintentional monument. So I think that this difference can be seen also what you were mentioning between what is intentional. A parliament like the Reichstag is intentional. The meaning taken by a particular building which was not inserted in a network of other similar buildings, one that history has made a selection is different. This building might acquire historical value and becomes a sort of unintentional monument because it was being simply to function in a system which has vanished. So if we look at architecture today, I think that monumentality is absolutely everywhere, and I think that let's take the program of the museum today and the way in which museums function as a monument, as markers within the city, in the way they condense the policy of a particular ruler at a particular philanthropist at a particular moment. So we are surrounded by monuments today, and perhaps by monuments that will sometime have trouble, like the big one and the main ones, that will be in trouble at changing in time.
I would like to ask perhaps a specific question, but I believe it touches also the core of your lecture, and it refers to the very first part of your lecture. Namely, I'm really very interested in the internal discussions in the 1970s in the French Communist Party. I mean, you have mentioned some. You have said, for example, that in Marxism architecture, or say in orthodox Marxism architecture, has a marginal role. But precisely at the time, in the end of the 1960s and in the 1970s, precisely in Paris, there have been published books which aimed at a kind of different, yet Marxist sculpted architecture, besides the contradiction of labor and capital, which you mentioned. So this would be very interesting for me.
Yeah, well, it's perhaps a seminar one could put together one day at the Berlage on politics and architecture seen in very specific details, and this could bring us to Berlage and the Dutch social democracy, and bring us to Germany in the 20s, and bring us to Italy in the early 40s. I think the network systems are very interesting. No, if I can just point out, and this history is not written at this point. So just what were the systems, to tell you what were the systems. I was a kid, I was 18 years old in '68, but I was already engaged in discussions with many architects who were in their 40s or 50s. Some of them had been in the resistance during the war, others had been at the École des Beaux-Arts in the 40s, others had been in the movement against the war in Algeria, and there were committees in where we were discussing architecture. So there was a group of communist architects which was very active. It was refusing any identification with the Russians, which was very knowledgeable about the Italian scene, which was working in a marginal way in the suburbs, doing sometimes good building, but was banned from major commission. And at the same time, you had groups of social scientists like which were connected with Henri Lefebvre, but Henri Lefebvre had left the official party for years, but there were nonetheless contacts with him. There were people who were like Christian Topalov, Pretzey, and others working to construct a Marxist theory of the city. So I can give you some names if you want. Someone like Manuel Castells, who later wrote about the city of networks, was also loosely connected with these research groups. There were then the magazines, the journals like La Nouvelle Critique, which were places of confrontation, not only in the field of architecture, but also in the field of linguistics, or with people like Julia Kristeva or Solers, or in the field of cinema with Godard and others. So there was a very interesting a system in which intellectuals were talking together, but also talking with people who were in politics but were coming from the working class. So my best memories of that time were really encountering people who organizing groups of discussion of architecture with a guy who was a trade union leader, with a guy who was simply in the building industry and was doing politics, and a guy who was the mayor from a suburb. And this atmosphere of dialogue is something which, to a large extent, is lost today. Because today, what political parties were in France, in Italy, in Spain, and to some extent also in the Netherlands or in other parts of Europe, today this type of social life and communication is lost and is mediated through the press, through television, through books sometimes. But the actual human interaction was really very exciting and interesting, and led to changes. To changes in the, for instance, the cynicism. I'll just give you one example. I worked in a suburb of Paris as a town planning consultant it was perhaps my first job in the early 70s. And there was a big scheme for the urban renewal of that particular city, which meant getting rid of everything, destroying everything, the old fabric, and building horrendous high-rise buildings, because they were the most active architects in all the municipalities. Right-wing socialists or communists were not the critical ones. They were people who were bringing money to the cash register of their respective party. So I had to fight against some communist architects who were making money and not very interested in innovation, in order to promote restoring the old center and doing better buildings. And I had to do it giving political reasons, because giving my own reasons that it was immensely better from the point of view of architecture was not enough. I had to say that you could not, that it would be a political risk at term to have to carry the responsibility of having done monstrous buildings or having destroyed urban life. And this is exactly what is happening where this type of political line has not been implemented. So the quality of this discussion, where you had to talk, also you had to take the mayor to a place where there were better buildings and show him, and you had to bring architects who would talk with him. But this kind of interaction was really interesting and changed, in a way, the rather cynical view of some of these political activists. They were thinking, okay, what is important is to get better wages. What is important is perhaps to get better healthcare. But who cares about the city? It's reformist, social democratic, not anti-revolutionary perspective, and we should not care. But in fact, it is dealing with these issues that the left-wing municipalities that stuck with these issues are the ones who have better survived.
Another urgent question. Well, the bar is open, and Jean-Louis, thank you very much for being here.
That's the best news of the evening. The bar is open. Thank you.